There's two things that have dominated and created our world. Step one is in 1945, the Americans found themselves facing down Stalin in Europe. We're like, oh, we do not want to tangle with this guy alone. We need allies to stand between us and the Soviet forces. But World War II had been the most destructive conflict in human history, and the only allies were countries that had barely survived it. So we needed to provide something to induce them to not cut a separate deal with the Soviets. And we came up with globalization. Before globalization, everyone was kind of left to their own in terms of development. And if you had iron ore and coal and food and oil, you could industrialize. But if you didn't have all those things, you were probably a colony. Well, with globalization, you now only needed one, and you could trade for the others. And so we all started to develop and industrialize and urbanize together. After 75 years, that has brought us the global system we now know with global finance and global energy and global supply chains and global infrastructure and global agriculture. And so we have a population of 8 billion people, living more wealthy than any other period in human history.
Correct.
With small countries and big countries all in the milieu together. But as we've made that transition, we've changed the way we live. Pre-industrialization, we all lived on subsistence farms. Mm-hmm. But as these new industrial jobs became available, we took them, and they were all in the cities. Well, in the countryside, kids are free labor. You have as many as you can, and then maybe one more, because that's how you know you've had too many. You move into town, you live in a condo, and kids are just sources of migraines. So you have one or two, maybe three. You play that forward for 75 years. And it's not that we're running out of children globally. That happened 30 years ago. It's that we're now running out of working-aged adults. Also, the Americans created globalization as a security ploy. Cold War ended 30 years ago. We're out of that business. So the security underpinnings that allow trade to happen are mostly gone. And the consumption that is done by young people is almost gone. And this was always going to be the decade that both of these trends broke at the same time. Now, China specifically is the perfect manifestation of what sort of glory demographic change and globalized security can bring to a country. Because for the first time in their history, they weren't preyed upon by the outsiders. They were able to consolidate internally, and they were able to use their large population to create an economies of scale to take advantage of the global environment. That had never happened to them before. You fast forward that to today, however, and the Americans have lost interest in maintaining the trade. We're turning a little bit more nationalist on the Chinese specifically. And their demographic transition was the fastest in human history. And according to the newest data we have, not only did they overcount their population by about 100 million people, they now have more people in their 60s than their 50s and their 40s and their 30s and their 20s. And so we are looking at abject demographic collapse in the Chinese space this decade. And that assumes that none of the Chinese dependencies on the American Navy to import and export become a problem. So we're really looking at a simultaneous crisis here in China that is demographic, that is political, that is cultural, that is agricultural, that is in trade, that is in finance, all at the same time. And there is no way they walk away from this. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're going to think of China 20 years from now, kind of like we think of the Soviet Union today. You know, it had a good run and then it just imploded. Let's see, what's the best way to put this? Chairman Xi, ruling China is a difficult task. There's a lot of different geographies. It doesn't hold together well. Yes, China, using air quotes here on China, has existed in some form for 3,000 years, but it's only been unified in roughly the shape we recognize today for a total of 300 of those years. Half of that's under the Mongol occupation, and the remainder, most of that is under the American-led globalized system, where we basically said colonization is no longer kosher. The only way that you can kind of rule the space is to purge the system of competing political and economic influences.
Correct.
And Xi started that process 10 years ago and more or less completed the purge of the political system 5 years ago. But then he spent the last 5 years purging the bureaucracy of any potential power centers that could challenge him. And in doing so, he's gotten rid of everyone in the country that is competent. So now it is just him. And in many ways, he's kind of become what Donald Trump always wanted to be. He's got the adoration from people below, the zealots, and he's got the voices in his head, and that's how he rules. And there's absolutely nothing in between. And that means we're seeing policy collapses across the entire system. And the balloon situation is a good example. So under COVID, the Chinese were carrying out this very hateful foreign policy that they kind of called wolf warrior, which is basically China is right, you're wrong, you're stupid, you're going to die, and China's going to take over everything. So when you hear people saying that they think China's going to dominate, that's wolf warrior diplomacy kind of working behind the scenes. There's not a lot behind it, but it riles people up. Well, it led to some of the greatest foreign policy disasters in China's history. So the Biden administration has killed the Chinese semiconductor sector. They are dependent upon the Russians for energy, but the Russian energy cannot be produced over the long term by the Russians. So they know there's an energy crisis in their future. They're experiencing an outbreak of something called African swine fever, which is endangering their food supplies. Their financial system is basically a really, really badly run Enron or subprime at scale. And so they see all of these pressures, and Xi knows that the jig is almost up. And so starting about 2 to 3 months ago, he started forcing the bureaucracy, because he has to have one-on-one conversations anymore. He can't just say stuff and make it happen because all the competent people are gone. He started tilting things towards a more productive or at least less hostile direction. And as a result, Secretary of State Blinken was about to go to China. Well, when you don't have a functional bureaucracy, when you don't have functional communication within your own government, all it takes is one dude who thinks he's doing the great leader's will to throw things off. And we now know from our communications with the Chinese that Xi didn't know about the balloon. And the foreign ministry didn't know about the balloon. And it looks like hardly anyone in the military knew about the balloon. That means it was just some dumbass in the intelligence services who thought that this is what was necessary, and so slapped it together and sent it off. And it led to a complete diplomatic meltdown with the United States. And even if you're of the belief that Biden is ultimately looking for a way to live with the Chinese, events like this, at a minimum, are going to push back the date where we can even think about that for 3 to 6 months. And to be perfectly blunt, China doesn't have a lot of time. One of the things to keep in mind, I think it's great to compare what's going on in the Russian space to what's going on in the Chinese space. So from the Russian point of view, their population is dying out as well for a mix of reasons, some of which overlap. And they feel that if they don't militarily act to get what they see as a more defensible perimeter now, that they will not have the military capacity to try it 5-10 years down the line. And they're right. So there is a scenario where if Russia wins this war and a couple wars beyond it, they actually are in a better position strategically. China doesn't have anything like that. There is no country or series of countries within reach that they could conquer. There is no war they could launch that would help. This is a country that, unlike Russia, is based on the import of raw materials and the export of finished goods. This is a country that imports almost all of the technology it needs and many of the intermediate parts. Really, it's best to think of China not as a manufacturing center, but as an assembly center. And I don't say that to denigrate them. It's a different sort of economic model, and that means you have to have different support structures internationally in order to make it work. And for China, it's all about the movement, and it's movement they can't control. The U.S. Navy may only have half as many ships as the Chinese, but our fleet is fully blue water. Only 10% of the Chinese fleet in combat operations could sail more than 400 miles from the coast. That's not enough to support a global mercantile empire. We do that for them as part of globalization. So even if they were to capture Taiwan without firing a shot, it really wouldn't solve anything, because they import 75% of their energy and 80% of the materials that allow them to grow their own food. So in any war scenario, you put a couple of destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin, doesn't matter who you are, and you've destroyed the Chinese system. It'll die within 6 to 12 months, and you'll trigger a famine that will ultimately kill hundreds of millions of people. That would be the end, and the Chinese know that. Now, that doesn't mean it's risk-free. That doesn't mean I'm belittling what you're suggesting here. There is a chance that it could happen, even though I don't think it's a very high one. If the Chinese admit to themselves that they're facing demographic, economic, agriculture, and trade crises all at once that will tear their system down, and I think they do realize that, then there's something to be said for picking the time and the place of a war, even if you know you're going to lose, because it lets you write the narrative, even if it's one of national failure. And if you're facing a deindustrialization collapse, that might allow the CCP to persist as a political ruler of the system into whatever's next. And so if you can guarantee your personal power for the low cost of 300 to 500 million dead Chinese from famine, that might be worth the cost.
So
make no mistake, this is not a war of expansion. I'm really not worried about the United States. So number one, we have the best demography in the advanced world and a better demography than most of the developing world. At current rates of aging, we will be younger on average than the Mexicans, the Indians, the Indonesians, and the Brazilians at some point in the early 2050s. We became younger on average than the Chinese over a decade ago. In addition, the United States created global trade. And one of the conditions in order to induce countries to join our security network was that we wouldn't take advantage of that. So as a percent of GDP, we are the least involved with the major economies in the world. And most of our economic integration is with Mexico and Canada. That's like almost half of our total. So if you factor that out, as a percent of GDP, our total exposure to the entire world is less than 10% of GDP, and a big chunk of that has to do with the shale revolution and energy exports. Take that out, you slim it down even more. Our weakness also we're the world's largest producer of oil and the world's largest producer and exporter of foodstuffs. Our biggest weakness is in electronics manufacture. And if China were to disappear tomorrow, yeah, that's going to be a pain in the ass. We're going to have to rebuild that from scratch. We're going to have to double the size of the industrial plant over the course of the next 5 years. And you think we have an inflation problem now, just wait till we lose access to Chinese goods and we have to build out our own system. But that will generate the fastest economic growth in the history of our country. And when it is done, we will have more reliable partners closer to home with shorter supply chains that use less energy and use workers that are local and sell to consumers that are local. This is a good story.
Okay, so
and all we have to do is build up ourselves to make it happen. The hardest part of geopolitics, especially demography, is timing.
Yeah.
One of the problems with one of the problems with demography is this has never happened before. We've never had global aging. What I've described for China is an extreme case, but it's happening everywhere. So N equals 0 historically for points of comparison.
Right.
The reason why this is the decade that I think it's really going to go down is this is the decade where not just China, but a lot of other countries literally age into mass retirement.
And this is pretty much
no longer enough people under 30 to even theoretically repopulate.
This is pretty much what happened to Japan, right? I mean, in the 80s, everybody thought Japan was going to take over the world. And then all of a sudden, Japan fell off the map.
Absolutely. Part of that was a debt issue, which the Chinese had actually a bigger debt issue. Part of it is demographic. But the two big differences between the Japanese and the Chinese, Japan saw this coming 30 years ago and took steps to boost their birth rate and relocate industrial plant to better locations like the United States. They're as prepared as they can be.
Right.
China's done none of that.